Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Soldiers of Cinema podcast. I'm Clark Coffey, and with me, as always, is Mr. Cullen McFader. How are you, sir?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing well. I had surgery on my wrist last week, so that's been exciting. Not really, actually. It's kind of miserable, but side benefit is that I had plenty of time to watch your choice of film for today's episode, which, and this is going to probably, I mean, they've already seen the title of the episode, when they clicked on it. So it's not like this is going to be a surprise, but I was surprised when you mentioned it. This is the one film of yours that you've chosen that I like. All the other ones I've been like, okay, that makes sense. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, sure. Like I may not have seen it, but I'm like, okay, cool. When you said Star Wars Episode 2, Attack of the Clones for this episode, I didn't know if you were being serious or not. I thought, okay, is it April 1st? Oh, wait a minute, what's going on? And let me preface, like, real quick. I know I'm, like, going on and on here, Cullen. I'll give you a second. But I just want to say, because I started off kind of, you could be like, oh, Clark's making fun of Star Wars. And I'm really not. Star Wars has a special place in my heart, as a story, as an idea, as the original films from my childhood. But I can't say that I'm the biggest fan of the prequel series, but there's a lot to talk about here. I think it's going to be a really interesting episode, whether you love Star Wars, whether you don't.
It was just before dawn. They came out of nowhere.
Do you have any idea who's behind this attack?
We will find out who's trying to kill you, Padme. I promise you.
Escort the senator back to Naboo. She'll be safer there.
I do not like this idea of hiding.
Sometimes we must do what is requested of us.
Dangerous and disturbing this puzzle is.
You're using her as bait. I'm a Jedi.
A Jedi! What do you know?
Follow that speeder! He went that way.
This is a shortcut, I think.
Anakin! How many times have I told you?
Stay away from the park couplings.
We decided to come and rescue you. Good job.
But I'm curious about what was kind of behind your choice here. Like, what were you thinking?
I was gonna say that's funny when you said that the fact that you were off for a week was the benefit of watching these, because I don't know if I would consider that necessarily a benefit of having a week off to watch them. But no, so it actually came to me when a few episodes ago we were discussing the fact that somebody had mentioned to you that it's like every time we do a movie we both like love it and we're always like super into them.
Yeah.
And I'm on your side with this. It's not, I didn't pick this movie out of a place of love at all, but more so a place of intrigue and interest. And I figured it would be a kind of interesting twist to take a movie that I know we both aren't particularly fond of from a filmmaking standpoint.
Right.
And what I do want to make clear is that this is not going to be an episode of us just like going through and nitpicking every little thing and like making fun of it and things like that. No. I have no interest, in, you don't either, of doing an episode like that, but rather what we want to do is, love them or hate them, these 3 prequel Star Wars films, just like the original trilogy, had a massive impact on how films are made, pop culture, for better or for worse. And so I think it to me would be, and hopefully will be, a very interesting episode to discuss those kind of ramifications, like what, and of course we're going to discuss the details of the movie as well. But I think the impact is really what drew me to this, and just kind of looking at the way that films are made today, especially, big blockbusters where it's a lot of green screen and things like that. Well, that all kind of started with, especially with Attack of the Clones, to a degree with Phantom Menace, but especially that Attack of the Clones was kind of the one that everything sort of fell into place in that way. So I think that'll be a really interesting discussion. We've got, we had our little preliminary discussion, and it was quite interesting. And I think we just want to jump in because we were. No,
I can't wait. There's so many. Yeah. I mean, it's almost like, this is going to be challenging because, with the exception of going into like a 4-hour episode, I mean, there's so much to talk about here because, the context is so important. I mean, we're definitely, like you said, we're going to talk about the film itself on its own merits as it stands just as a piece of cinema. but you cannot separate, and you shouldn't separate this film out of Lucas's legacy, out of the legacy of Star Wars, out of the impact of ILM and CGI and digital filmmaking. And I mean, I hadn't thought about Star Wars much until I started watching this film again. And just to give context to the listener, because I had all this time where I kind of had to sit and be pretty still and have my arm kind of elevated and I couldn't really do much, and all of the like anesthesia is wearing off. So I don't know how much that colored my viewing experience, because I still maybe had some of those drugs rolling around in my head as I watched these. But I actually, not only did I watch episode 2, but I actually started chronologically with Phantom Menace, and I watched that, this, and then the third, and then I went back and I watched the original trilogy, because I hadn't seen any of these 6 films in a very, very, very long time. And I think, and they really blend into me, and I don't mean any disrespect, but the more current, modern, like Disney Star Wars films really blend into me, and I think I've seen 1 or 2 of them. I don't even know which ones I've seen. I can't even tell them apart, to be frank. So I left the Disney Star Wars films kind of out of the equation in my mind. But I did
Lucas
watch
was uninvolved, so it's like kind of unrelated to what we're talking about anyway. So
right. I'm kind of like, those are not even in this conversation that we're having here. So, but I did watch this film in the context of having recently seen all 6, and I have to say I had forgotten, how huge Star Wars is for so many people. I mean, just culturally, how monolithically gigantic Star Wars is as a story, as a world, as a universe. And then, of course, watching Attack of the Clones, I'm just like, I mean, almost everything I see on television or on the screen in a theater now in some way kind of owes at least something to Attack of the Clones. I mean, I'm sitting here with my wife a few days ago watching a Ted Lasso episode of Ted Lasso, right? It's just like, single camera sitcom, basically, right? And every time they're in a studio, or hell, almost every time they're in any location, so many of the techniques that were pioneered in Attack of Clones have made themselves all the way down to like a little, single camera comedy on TV, where the entire environment is non-existent. And then where we've moved now you've got our, light screens and just this continued expansion of virtual worlds, the continued usage of CGI and its evolution,
the innovation of digital cinema.
Oh my God. So there's a ton. I mean, there's just a ton. And so I have mad crazy respects. I just want to say this right off the top before we go into things. I have a huge amount of respect for George Lucas. I'm fascinated by him as a filmmaker and as a businessman. I'm fascinated by the stories that exist behind these films, and how he was able to achieve so much, how he's had such a huge impact on, I mean, he's behind ILM, and then kind of therefore also behind Pixar.
And THX.
And THX. And, I mean, you would be hard-pressed to single out a single person who has had a greater impact on the industry and the technology of cinema than George Lucas. You just have to admit that, and you can't deny it. And it's absolutely worthy of respect and discussion. So I just want to preface that. Long-winded, but no matter what I say here, I have a huge amount of respect.
Well, much like Lucas talking about how he found it very tough to, cram as much as he could that he felt necessary into these movies, I feel like we're going to have a similar situation where we're just trying to put everything we can into this movie.
Well,
into this podcast, but I did something similar to you where I didn't get to watch all of them. Because I just spring is always a very busy time for me for work, so I just have been completely inundated with schedules and things like that lately. But I watched Phantom Menace, and then I watched this one just to get myself in the context of what the movie was like, and obviously I've seen these movies before as a kid and things like that. But
well, let's talk about that.
Let's get into our personal experiences.
We love to let's start there. We'll just take this elephant bite by bite. So. So let's talk about personal experience. Because I thought, erroneously, it sounds like, that you may have been exposed to the prequel trilogy first, but it sounds like you weren't, even though you're quite a bit younger. But go into your personal experience with this film originally.
Yeah, so I I do remember like being very young and seeing A New Hope, Star Wars for the first time. And
I mean, presumably at home, right?
Like I do actually. I remember I was at a friend of my mom's house. I was probably only 3. Like I have no memory other than remembering that I was terrified of Darth Vader, and I thought that it was like, I was so young that I couldn't even interpret the events. And I just have this very, very distinct memory of thinking that Princess Leia was inside of like a cage in a zoo when she's in the prison, and that Darth Vader was some sort of gorilla that had put her in there. And that was my interpretation of these scenes. And just to be clear, like I was so young when I first saw that movie that I couldn't read the opening crawl on my own. Like I do, I have a very vivid memory of my mom's friend's son reading the opening crawl to me as it happened, and still I got
remember it. But you remember it, like it stood out enough in your memory that even though you were illiterate, I mean, it sounds weird to say illiterate, but you're supposed to be. You're like a child, but you can't even read, and you weren't even able to understand the plot, which is pretty simple in the first, in New Hope. You still could, but it stood out enough to you. It had enough of an impact. You remember it. That's pretty amazing.
Yeah, I very, very distinctly remember those 2 things specifically. Not much else about it. And then when I was probably around the time, like a little bit before Attack of the Clones came out. So what was
now, how old are
right? So I would have been 4 at that time.
Okay.
So the first time I saw it, I would have been.
Hold on. We're going too fast for me. My brain. I know you're young. Okay, so I just want to. So it's 2002.
Yeah.
You as a very. How old are you again?
So the first time I saw New Hope was probably a little bit before that. It was probably around 2000 the first time I saw New Hope.
So you're like 2.
So I was 2 years old, probably.
Oh my gosh.
So that would be my guess. Is like I have no memories other than those 2 very distinct blips of just
when did you see Attack of the Clones?
Probably around the time it came out. I can't remember if I saw it in theaters or if I saw it slightly after. But what I do know for sure is that when I really got into Star Wars, because that first time I saw it, when I was illiterate, couldn't read it, remember nothing about it, I didn't fully understand it. I was like a toddler, right? So around the time Attack of the Clones came out, which is 2002, so I was around 4 years old. I remember, I think it was a bit before it came out, my dad bought the original trilogy, like a DVD box set.
Okay.
It was the old like gray ones, if anyone remembers those at home. And so we watched through them, and then, it was basically like that might as well have been the first time I saw Star Wars, because that to me was really when I got super into them. I was like obsessed with them. And I don't remember if I saw Attack of the Clones in theaters or if I saw it at home. I can't remember that.
Now, did you see Phantom Menace? Had you seen Phantom Menace?
No, that came out. No, I had not seen Phantom Menace either. I hadn't seen it all. Yeah. I saw the prequels out of order. But I do know that I saw Revenge of the Sith in theaters. I definitely saw that like opening day. Mm-hmm. So I was really into like the original trilogy, and I think we briefly talked about this like 30 or 35 episodes ago when we were talking about what got us into filmmaking. But as a kid, I used to be really into watching like the behind the scenes stuff, which was great when DVDs came out when I was young, because VHS very rarely had things like
ever,
that.
If ever. I don't ever remember. I mean, it was so rare.
I remember I had a few that like at the end of the credits, it would just roll into like maybe a 20-minute reel of BTS
when I was a kid, we had none of that. The closest that I ever got to behind the scenes stuff would be like press kit stuff that, let's say, like maybe HBO or Showtime, some like premium cable channel, right? They would basically run as kind of filler, and basically I'm sure studios gave them this content, so it was like free to them. They would run like these press kit videos, maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes, whatever, of like promoting a film that was going to be coming up on HBO soon, so that was like the closest you ever got to behind the scenes. And usually those were pretty, they were cheesy, just promotional interviews and stuff with the actors is what those usually boiled down to. But I'm jealous of you. I didn't get to have exposure to that behind the scenes stuff.
But that's I think what got me into filmmaking, right? Like I remember watching Jurassic Park, the behind the scenes for that, and a little bit later I watched the behind the scenes of Lord of the Rings, which are basically like film schools unto themselves. And
my gosh!
Yeah, but Star Wars too. Like I remember watching, them making the models and shooting the models, and I think a big part of why that impacted me so much was because I was like, I can do this. Like all they're doing is filming basically Lego sets,
right?
Like that. So that's kind of where I think like my start in filmmaking kind of happened. And,
that's
and also the other thing too was that everything in the originals was all like you're just out in a forest or you're on like a glacier or you're in a desert or something. And like I remember it would snow at school and we'd have a big, we'd have this huge field in my elementary school and we'd build trenches and like pretend that the AT-ATs in Empire Strikes Back were coming and we were like the rebels fighting off these things. And so like it was like very tangible that you could act out and pretend and be in these movies as a kid. Whereas I, even though I grew up while they were coming out and a lot of my friends liked them and things like that, I never really felt the same connection to the prequels for kind of those, I think, two reasons. Well, A, the plots were a lot more convoluted and complicated, right. And I think that, like, for my entire childhood, I just didn't know what these movies were about. But also,
I don't know if I still do.
Yeah, I know. It's still a good question of whether I do. But I also remember, like, I'd watch the behind the scenes on them, and I'd be like, well, they're just doing everything with a computer. Like, I can't do that. Like, I can't remake any of this stuff unless, of course, I turn it into something practical. But I'm not watching people and learning from people doing things that I can sit down with my VHS camcorder and do.
Right.
And then same thing with the locations, right? Like, especially, Phantom Menace, there are some practical locations, there are some practical effects and things like that. But Attack of the Clones, the vast majority of locations and props and sets and things like that and just visual effects in general are all digital, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there was no, like, I couldn't run around in the snow and pretend to be in Phantom Menace or in Attack of the Clones or whatever, because it was just so
You didn't want to be Jar Jar Binks? You didn't want to run around? I mean, well, I know that's not Attack of the Clones.
That was the only exception, is that I would walk around as Jar Jar. But yeah, so I think that was a, in brief, that was kind of my experience firsthand with these movies. Like, I don't recall the first time that I saw them specifically, but I do know, obviously, I grew up with them, and so they are a very huge part of my childhood. But
okay, now let me ask.
The original trilogy was definitely much more impactful on me.
When you did get older, I assume you probably revisited the films, not to study them like we're doing here in the podcast, but I'm assuming you revisited them when you were older, where you could kind of wrap your head around it a little more.
Yeah.
I mean, what are, like, what do you feel like, just like before we kind of dive in and get kind of analytical about it? I mean, what's your just like gut kind of feeling that first time you remember watching them and you were old enough to kind of really formulate, an opinion about it?
Yeah, I think the fact that I had just seen them all so frequently, like, even though I wasn't super fond of the prequels as a kid and again, didn't have that connection, I still watched them a lot just because I would watch all of them. And so I don't know, it's tough to really remember, like, a time when I had, perhaps with exception to this time rewatching them, because this time it's been probably a decade or more since I've seen them.
Okay. Oh, wow. Okay.
But as a kid, even getting into like my early teens and things like that, like, they were just so constant in my life that I kind of just.
So what did you think then? Now, what did you think when you watched this film? And you can kind of put it in a little bit of the context that you saw Phantom Menace.
Yeah.
I mean, what are your thoughts now then? So you watched it recently. Here you are in your 20s. Like, just this film as itself, as a piece of cinema, what did you think about it?
I probably had a more positive experience watching it this time than I ever did as a kid.
Okay.
Like,
what do you think?
And I think because I was analyzing it and I was looking at it through a completely new lens, especially as someone who has, like, now actually made movies and and in the context of where the film industry is today too, and understanding that a lot more.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that, positive in the sense that I was like, oh, you know what, I actually love this movie, because I have the same opinion in terms of, like, I don't know when the next time I would really want to watch this movie ever will be, but I think positive in the fact that I actually got something out of it. I definitely watched it this time and sort of went like, that's actually a really interesting decision that George Lucas is making there. Like, I don't know if I necessarily agree with the decision, but it's very fascinating.
So as far as like the story goes, like, if we just boil it down to the most, base kind of like, the story is not pulling you in, like, that you're not watching this and being kind of captivated by the story or the characters.
There's no level to which I was like, rewatching it and engaged with it. It was more like an interesting experiment, which again, I would consider a positive because I was interested as I watched it. I was like, I'm just so fascinated by this, and like, why did that happen there? Why is there a diner owner with 4 arms who pulls up his pants, and so like this very bizarre stuff, but it is kind of a little bit entertaining. The thing
is that, like, as you describe that, I mean, I can, to the absolute nth level of detail, remember exactly what you're talking about, because when I saw it, I just had the same thought. I'm just like, I'm trying to just peer inside the mind of Lucas and understand exactly, like, I mean, he is a unique dude. Like, you just
I would
have to admit,
die to go out for lunch with him, and as David Lynch describes, get salads, and like I would love. I find Lucas, and even Lucas's, I'll be brief because we'll talk about this a little bit later, but Lucas's outlook on art in general, I think, is really, really fascinating.
Ooh, I definitely do want to get to that. I want to hear more about it, because I'm not sure that I actually have really read much, or I can see through the work that he's done. I can maybe extrapolate what he might think, but I'm interested to hear what you've learned. But I'll share my personal experience real quick too, just to kind of provide like some contrast, or maybe to yours. So obviously, being 47 years old myself, I wasn't old enough to see the New Hope or Empire Strikes Back at the theater, but I had seen them though on like VHS, like taped it off HBO, or I actually think I had seen New Hope many, many, many times as a young child. I don't know exactly why this is, and it could have just been like my own personal logistics, like we had somehow, but I think New Hope had been on like cable TV, but it took a lot longer for Empire Strikes Back to do the same. So my exposure to Empire Strikes Back was much, much, much less. But I saw Return of the Jedi at the theater, and I have a very specific memory of that because my father took me to the premiere in our local city. I mean, the premiere in St. Louis where we live.
So, but mirrored with my experience with Revenge of the Sith in that sense.
Okay, yeah, and I'm young. I mean, when was Return of the Jedi?
83,
released?
I think. 83.
Okay, so I think I had just turned probably 7. If it was, because I think it was like May or something, like spring or something of so I just turned 7. And I remember because like the local TV news even interviewed us like after we got out of the screening, and it was like, what'd you think of the movie and stuff? And I mean, of course I loved it. I'm a kid and I'm in a theater and it's my dad's taking me. I mean, it was an awesome, I still remember it and I have extremely fond remembrances of that. Having said all that, and just to give context for when the prequel series came, although I liked these films as a kid, they were far from my favorite films or films that I really truly felt connected to. And we've talked about these. It was, I think, the first films that I selected when we kind of switched formats for the podcast. But that was actually the Mad Max trilogy, original trilogy, was the kind of film I was much more interested in. Just grittier, more kind of exploitive. But I was captivated by those Mad Max films, and especially Road Warrior, so much more so than I was with Star Wars. Again, not to say that I didn't dig them as a kid, but it just wasn't the same thing. I mean, honestly, I even, I feel like I liked like Indiana Jones series a lot more when I was a kid, and even like the Rocky films, I think I felt more attached to than Star Wars. So liked them, but I wasn't like obsessed. I wasn't like a fanatic about them. So when the prequels came out, I had kind of the same experience I think that a lot of people did. I went to go see Phantom Menace. I didn't see it on opening day or something. I wasn't standing in line, but I went to go see it at the theater, and I was pretty disappointed. I was pretty let down. I was older. The film seemed to me to be made for somebody who might be like 8 or 6. I don't know.
While simultaneously dealing with like intergalactic politics and
right. It would be like all the action and all this kind of humor was kind of clearly geared towards a very, very young child. You have a very young protagonist, but then you had these long sections of like diplomacy talk and politics and stuff, and I'm just like, well, neither of these things are interesting to me at all. And so I really just kind of dropped out of the Star Wars world at that moment, to be honest. I can't remember when I saw Attack of the Clones. I don't know if I saw it at the theater. I have no recollection if I did. I don't know. Matter of fact, when I was watching it now for this podcast, I still couldn't remember if I had maybe ever seen it or not. Even
right.
I honestly don't know. Maybe I had seen it years and years ago, and I just forgot most about it. Most everything about it. But I honestly don't know.
Mm-hmm.
I really don't know if I even saw this film before. So, so to fast forward then to now, having watched it now, I mean, I think a lot like you. I was watching this kind of certainly interested in the context of the technology and the cultural impact of Star Wars as a whole, and how this was such a shot across the bow, or this this really initiating a sea change in how cinema was going to be created, and how much on the cutting edge Lucas actually was with this technology that he was pushing through with the making of this film. That's all super intriguing to me. Lucas as an artist is interesting to me, and the impact that he's had. But the story didn't do a whole lot for me. I found myself being pretty bored with the film. I wasn't very engaged with it. I had to really continue to kind of turn my focus back to the film.
Definitely. Yeah,
it was honestly kind of a little bit of a work of willpower to get through it. I just wasn't very. I thought, when there's humor, it's kind of not my sense of humor. It's when there's action, I don't feel like there's really any significant stakes. I think that's one of the big issues with this series as a whole, is that especially with moving forth from the original trilogy, I don't believe any of the stakes ever. It's always the universe is gonna be destroyed, but I'm I never buy any of the stakes. I keep getting introduced to more and more and more characters that I care less and less and less about,
with very bizarre names.
Yeah, and I can't keep track of all the planets, and then I think one of the most and I'm by far from the first person to ever take note of this, but this move to make tangible and literal the Force. From being kind of like a spirit, like
or whatever,
this metachlorians or something, just all these decisions that he made, just really left me kind of cold. So, so I guess a lot like you, I respect so much that surrounds the film, and I'm interested in so much that surrounds the film, but the film itself, I just really don't think too much about.
Well, I think perhaps that's a good segue to go into, because I remember, again, watching the behind the scenes of the movie, and still to this day reading about things about that Lucas said or that he did during the making of this. Nothing controversial, of course, but I've always just had this thought that it doesn't seem like he really even wanted to make them. There's kind of a caveat with that too, which is that I think that he did the original trilogy, directed and wrote A New Hope, wrote the story for but not the screenplay for, and didn't direct Empire or Return of the Jedi. He might have written the screenplay or a draft of the screenplay for Return of the Jedi. I can't remember, but I know Empire was definitely his most hands-off one of the originals.
Right.
And then I feel like he just kind of realized that he dug himself in this hole by naming them 4, 5, 6, and realizing, okay, now everyone expects me to do obviously 1, 2, and 3, and just hearing about the fact that he
back then. But wait, sorry to interrupt. But back then, that wasn't known by anybody.
So only when A New Hope came out. A New Hope was the only one that didn't have a number originally. But then when Empire came out, that had Episode 5.
For real?
Yeah.
And that even in its original theatrical release, not when he redid them.
Because before Empire came out in 80, a month before, they re-released A New Hope with a number in front of it, so people wouldn't be confused. Yeah. So he made that decision then, which is kind of insane when you think about it. But yeah,
I know that's so weird,
because he didn't want people to be confused going into Empire, being why is this episode 5? Have I missed 4 other ones? So
it's so confusing, dude.
Yeah. So anyway, I think that he, with a caveat to that being that he realized, I'm swimming in money.
Mm-hmm.
I can make these whatever I want. He self-financed them through Lucasfilm, of course, his company that he had full control over. And I think he was just I'm really interested in technology. I'm really interested in furthering special effects and things like that. I'm just going to kind of use these as a vessel to make all these technological advancements, to try out all these new filmmaking toys, which, hey, I don't blame him for that. That if I had that money, I'd do that too. Sure. And then, but you can tell that he really did not care about the plots because he wrote them in, like, I think it's famous that he wrote Phantom Menace in like 2 weeks or something, or this one he finished the screenplay for like 3 months before they went to, and it was the rough draft that he finished 3 months before they went to camera. And so and again, I think both of us also kind of agree that like plot isn't super important. I don't focus on plot, but when nothing else is going on in the movie, it is kind of nice to be able to grab onto something and go like, okay, there's a trajectory here. But
I mean, there's going to be people who would listen to this who are, Star Wars experts, and I'm not one, and so I don't want to speak out of school. I don't know, my understanding of his writing, was that he spent a lot of time and wrote really long drafts and had all this backstory, but I'm not sure. I don't want to contradict what you're saying because I'm not sure about any of that, exactly. But I mean, I do the part that like resonates with me though, that feels right, is that, he's always very clearly been very interested in the technology of filmmaking, and he's always been wanted to be on the cutting edge of that. And, even with the first Star Wars, in 77, I mean, with his creation of ILM and all the effect shots there. Now, of course, they were doing, models and some other stuff, but I mean, I feel like the work that I was going to say I feel like the work they did for that holds up so well, and it does, but I also know that it's been modified over the years it's been augmented in different ways, but you still see model work and everything there. They haven't replaced that with CGI, and it holds up so amazingly well. And I would add, it looks so much better than the CGI in Attack of the Clones, but yeah, I mean, I think you're probably right. I mean, it seems to be, it's so tough. I don't know the guy. I'm not inside his head, but it seems almost like that's a reasonable argument to make, that he made these films as kind of an excuse to do a lot of work pushing ILM and pushing digital filmmaking and pushing CGI. I mean, he says that he wants to make films for kids. I feel like I've heard him say that about these films, that was important to him, and that he wants to tell a story about how power corrupts, and this whole long story of the dark side and the Force, and is it Palpatine, the guy who is like he's just this politician, but then in a moment of crisis he's given all this power, and that power of course corrupts ultimately and leads to the Empire and all this.
Well, and that's his whole plan, right? That's Palpatine's secret plan the whole time, is he's pulling the strings on both sides.
Right. So so I don't know what George's motives are, but it definitely does seem like he is heavily invested in the technology behind the films, at least as much as he is as the story in them, and maybe more so, arguably, for sure.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, it's certainly hard to argue that he wasn't successful, at least as far as it goes monetarily speaking, because holy crap. I mean, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's talk about, his direction and his writing. I mean, let's focus on the writing first. I mean, you and I both kind of hinted that, when we watch the film, it vacillates really hugely between, these giant epic kind of action sequences with all of these like clones or droids or whatever, all this like giant stuff going on, CGI everywhere, all over the place. And then these like extended, what I was particularly just amazed by was how much just people sitting around talking there is in this film. I mean, it's like, right off the bat, it's like we open up and we're in this room with like 10 Jedi people just talking on, and it's like boring. I'm like, why do I even care about this? And there's so many scenes of just really not compelling dialogue spoken in not compelling ways.
Yes, yeah.
And it's like, it's kind of an interesting contrast, because for all that like Lucas's focus on technology and getting kinetic, captivating, awe-inspiring images, these giant worlds and creatures and spaceships and everything, and then it's just like a bunch of people talking in a room for so much of this film. I kind of was surprised they'd forgotten about that.
Well, it's also funny because, again, you compare even, again, the first, like A New Hope, to the prequels, where A New Hope's a very exciting, fun movie. Like it's very simple and straightforward, and so I always think it's kind of odd that that's kind of where my thought that like maybe he just really didn't pay a lot of attention to the screenplays because he wasn't beholden to some big production company, because there's Fox distributed.
So maybe he didn't have checks and balances,
Yeah, and maybe, so it's interesting to me that of course the themes and the overarching trajectory of the story of the prequels is very similar to the rise of like Hitler or like Octavian, the Roman emperor, or Napoleon even, where it's like you have this chancellor granted emergency powers who winds up kind of securing that, and so there's clearly an idea of like desire in terms of telling this grand operatic story about these characters, and yet when you get to the moment to moment of how it's done and how it's executed, it falls apart. It really does just slog at a scene to scene basis, where you just have, it's almost like I used to really be into, as a kid, it's really weird, but I used to be really into film noir and like 30s and 40s film noir movies.
Yeah.
And a lot of them are great. But you got a bad film noir movie when it is just the main character going from location to location asking people questions, and then and then finally he reveals the plot at the end, and that's it.
Right.
And that's what this movie reminds me of, and intentionally so. Like I think Lucas very much was actually pulling for a kind of noir feeling with this movie. You can tell that in the lighting in some moments, like when they're inside, there's the slits, and he kind of wanted it to be almost like Obi-Wan is like a detective in this movie and going to track down like who's trying to kill the
God,
Padme.
I didn't pick up any of these complexities.
But you wind up again with that kind of bad thing where it's just Obi-Wan showing up to a location, asking a few questions, getting his next lead, going to the next place, and doing the same thing and rinse and repeat with some action scenes scattered about,
right? And some like goofy like droid comedy, or some like kind of like creature, a little like weird creature farts in the background and laughs for a second. I mean, it's just weird,
and nothing comes naturally. Like there's no element of the story that is like occurs in kind of some natural way. It always has to be like a character for some reason making often a quite bizarre choice, and then like. Just again, this is really nitty gritty, but for example, the Padme and Anakin thing, obviously they've got to get together and have Luke and Leia. That has to be established in these three movies at some point.
Right.
But why a like ancient monk religion that forbids attachment and forbids romance would send the two like 20-year-olds who have been talking about how much they miss each other and think about each other and dream about each other very openly, why they'd be like, yeah, you know what, let's send them to the like Italy planet with the beautiful lakes. And it to me is kind of this thing where you have a situation where somebody wrote out all these things, all these beats that they have to hit. Okay, Anakin and Padme, they've got to get together. Obi-Wan has to find the clone army. He has to discover like these secrets and the separatists and all this stuff because we got to start the Clone Wars. We got to get to there, this and that and that. And so what you'd wind up with is having someone writing backwards. You've got someone being like, I've got to get to these points because he made the movies backwards. He made 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3. And so it's like, well, I know where I have to get. And I'm not super interested in these plots. I'm more interested in the technology. So I'm just going to kind of be like, okay, well, if this happens and they get there, that's fine. And I think that that's where these movies really fall apart. Again, I'm not cribbing on George Lucas. I think George Lucas is a really neat guy. I think that he has a really positive outlook, honestly, on filmmaking and things like that. But I do think that that's kind of where my theory comes from, that he just really didn't want to have to make these movies. I think that he just fell out of love with Star Wars and probably got sick of them, understandably, after them blowing up and being all anyone talked about for like 15 years, and probably every interview you've got to talk about them and be asked questions about them and things like that.
Well, why do you think he didn't make any other? Well, okay, I would a couple things. One, I want to comment on that, and then I want to ask a question. I almost blurted out there, but I want to wait a second. So, okay, I could tell you. I mean, I listened to the commentary track for Attack of the Clones and for Phantom Menace, both actually. And I was struck by how often Lucas would refer to the challenge of having to backfill all these story elements, like you just explained in detail. He would constantly talk about, okay, in this scene, I had to get this character here, and I had to get that character there, and I had to, I had to get, plant this story seed, and da da da. So he was constant. I mean, you can tell that he brings it up so often that it seems pretty clear to me that it was a major challenge. It was a major part of his focus was, how do I, it's like, and you got to think of it too. It's like, not only does he have those original 3 stories that, like you correctly stated, he's got to kind of backfill, right? He's got to every story point that he talks about in these films has to kind of end up somehow paying off in films that have already been made and consumed, and memorized by people, right? It's not just that these films have been watched by millions. I mean, they're like memorized by millions of people. But you also have this huge universe now of comics and novels and cartoons and
spin-offs.
You've got this giant Star Wars universe that fans know to the like every little detail about. And how in the world do you go and make films that are going to stand on their own, but also somehow fit into all these other pieces of story and this universe, and also like kind of pay off, so to speak, in those original 3 films? I mean, that's profoundly challenging. I mean, it's got to be an extraordinarily difficult challenge, and still have the films stand up on their own, be interesting on their own, make sense to somebody who's watching them on their own. I mean, you just can't. I don't think you can meet all those requirements. It's just not possible. So
yeah.
I think you're right. I mean, the compromise is huge. Now, question I might ask you would be, if your hypothesis is true that Lucas kind of maybe was burned out or was fulfilling kind of what he felt like was an obligation to make these 3 prequels. I like, why do you feel like he's never made another film then that's not been Star Wars after all these?
Well, yeah, so his wording is after he made the prequels and had, the response that he got to them. I think it was in like 2006 he did an interview where he basically just said, oh yeah, now I'm just going to make a bunch of art films that nobody will ever see but me.
Right.
Whether or not he's done that, I'm not sure. But I think that, and that kind of goes into, I guess we can talk about this now, which is his philosophy on filmmaking and art, which I find very fascinating. And I think actually probably will answer that question, which is that ironically, the guy who invented Star Wars seems to really, really hate the commercialization of like art. And I think sort of saw Star Wars as something that originally he was very passionate about. Obviously, he made the first one with like blood, sweat, and tears and was super passionate about it.
Absolutely.
But also just found himself like hating the politics of filmmaking in such a big budget level at Hollywood and getting this like franchise and pop culture and kind of speaks about the way that the merchandising, especially he's made billions and billions of dollars on merchandising alone of Star Wars, that was kind of like a means to an end. That he was like, I'm going to use that money to put towards my own films, which again, that's what he did here. These are financed by Lucas and Lucasfilm. And it seems like when he describes this thing about, like, he talks about, for example, he talks about filmmaking in the Soviet Union and like Tarkovsky and things like that, directors like that. And he talks about how they weren't beholden to any sort of dollar sign, that they could make these movies. They were funded primarily by the government. And he was like, there's obviously a lot of issues with Soviet Union and things like that. But that the fact that, a filmmaker could just get money to make art for the sake of the cultural like benefit of that, and not to make a return on an investment, and not to make a huge box office hit and things like that, that you could just have filmmakers pursuing perhaps a very pure form of filmmaking that is really difficult to do in the US and Canada and most of the Western, or most of the world today, period, because filmmaking is an expensive process. And so he talks about that with like great envy, though. He talks about that with this really, really like it's almost like this twinkle on his eye when he imagines being able to do that. And so I think that kind of is an insight to me that it's like he, if I look at his filmography in terms of the stuff that he's produced, obviously he produced the Indiana Jones movies and things like that. Like perhaps he's just not interested in directing larger budget movies, period. That might just be something that he feels like he would rather, maybe he is making these little indie art films that nobody has seen, that he says nobody will ever see, and just keeping them for himself. So that
just seems let's expand on that. I mean, this is interesting to me. So obviously, like, we're just speculating. We don't know. I've never met the dude, much less talked to him, and I'm not an expert, and so I don't know all the hints that might exist out there in interviews or Q&As or whatever might exist. But it's like we have a guy who comes out of the box with 3 really successful films that he writes and directs, right? You have 1971's THX 1138, which is a really interesting film in my opinion. You have American Graffiti in 73, which I think is also a really good film and totally unlike, Star Wars, right? And then he has Star Wars in 77, which he also produces, and boom. I mean, that sets everything in motion. Now, he operates as a producer for a lot of other things after that. But with the exception of being the writer for Return of the Jedi, he doesn't direct anything until 99, Phantom Menace, okay? And then he does, Phantom Menace, Attack of the Clones, Revenge of the Sith, 99 through 2005. He writes, produces, and directs those 3 films. And then never again does he direct or write, okay? It's so intriguing to me. I mean, if what you say is true, the guy's got more money than God. He's not beholden to anyone. He is in the position that you claim he envies. So why I just I'm not arguing against you. I'm just curious. I'm like,
no. Well, that's why I think.
Do you think he's so
fascinating because
burn him out? Did it just burn him out?
It's like an enigma. Like I think that's one of the reasons that I find him so fascinating to discuss, because it's like I genuinely don't have, other than the things that I've seen him talk about in interviews and that I just relayed. I don't know why he wouldn't be like, I'm going to finance my own drama and do something more in line with American Graffiti or THX or something like that.
I mean, I wonder if he's just kind of feels like kind of trapped. I mean, I wonder if it's just Star Wars has become such an all-encompassing, like, cultural, monolithic, gigantic thing. I almost wonder if he feels like if he does anything else,
it's almost like he's typecast.
Typecast, yes, but he doesn't have to, like, he could make any movie he wants, right? I mean, he could self-finance any movie. He could, there's like nothing he couldn't do if he wanted to. But I just wonder, I just posit the hypothesis. I mean, maybe it's kind of like he feels like Star Wars is such a legacy and it's such a gigantic thing that's gotten so much bigger than him. I mean, maybe he feels like if he puts something out there that he could somehow damage that or affect that or tarnish that. I mean, what if Lucas put out, just like, again, we're just being hypothetical here. Let's say, thought experiment. Lucas comes out with a very highly personal film that's, kind of like an art film like you describe. And it's completely, just radically couldn't be more different than anything Star Wars. And it's, and maybe it's controversial. Maybe it's, it's dark, or maybe it's, who knows, I mean, even the smallest things. I mean, it's like people could look at that, right? Watch that film and be like, whoa, this is also in the mind of the guy who brought us Star Wars. Ooh, that's kind of creepy. Yeah. There's like weird sex stuff in this, or or it's kinky, or it's weird, or it's, I don't know, whatever the hell, right? Yeah. So it's violent, or it's, it something, ask questions that are like scary or something. It could be a great film even. But people could maybe look at it and be like, oh gosh, I didn't realize like the mind behind my favorite Star Wars and Indiana Jones
and Jar Jar.
And Jar Jar is like so dark and like mysterious. Well, so I don't know. That's just one example. It's just one kind of hypothesis, right? Where it's like
there's merit there too, because I mean, there was Spielberg talking about how much challenge he had when he was doing Schindler's List about being like this family-friendly director who is suddenly doing this really graphic Holocaust movie, right? Yeah. So there's definitely a possibility that he could just be like feel.
But
like
I think even more so.
Yeah.
And I think Lucas is even at a more challenging position in that, at least Spielberg had made a lot of different kinds of films,
mm-hmm.
and he was making something. I mean, there are critics of Schindler's List, but I mean, it's not like that was a controversial film in the sense that he was like denying the Holocaust, or he was on the side of the Nazis, or I mean, he was kind of telling the story of a quote unquote good Nazi, which is a little challenging and controversial. But I mean, he was definitely saying like a culturally acceptable thing at the time. He wasn't he wasn't telling some controversial story. It was just that he was outside of his typecast as a director was his challenge. So imagine even further than being outside of the typecast challenge, but like potentially being in fear that like if you made something that was received controversially, as an artist, that you would like maybe tarnish this 50 plus years of the single most mythic cinema story in history. I'm just guessing. I'm just totally speaking out of my butt here, but I'm just using my imagination to think, wow, it would be intimidating to be like kind of the author of something that huge. And then you look to try to create something different, and you're like, oh my gosh, who knows what the heck could happen to everything I've done before this and this empire I've built. And just a thought, or maybe you're right. Maybe it's just as simple as like, God, I'm exhausted. He's old. He's 80, probably from 99 to 2005. It probably took a ton out of him. He's, got more money than God. Like I said, he could just be sitting there like, hey, I just enjoy spending time with my family, my wife, and hanging out. It could just be as simple as that. But
yeah,
he's got great hair. Maybe he just
I do think that this is why he makes a very fascinating subject.
Because you have to guess. Yeah, because you have to guess.
And it's like it does spark, I think, of a larger conversation about filmmaking, which I think actually, again, probably a good segue to actually get into the technology specifically that he pushed and changed so much.
It's super interesting.
These movies changed everything.
Right.
This was I do recall at the time being this like weird controversial sort of or semi-controversial thing about having actors just stand in front of green screens and react to nothing and all like the behind the scenes interviews with the actors talking about how it's really tough to be,
and boy,
especially in the third one with what's his name, General Grievous, I think, who is the entirely CGI droid monster that Obi-Wan fights.
It's a droid that coughs. Okay.
Yeah. And Ewan McGregor describing the fact that it was like really tough to play that scene because he had nothing to play off of. It was just like a tennis ball on a stick or whatever. And that was like this new, weird, wacky style of filmmaking. Well, look at, any of the Marvel movies that have come out, or any most big blockbusters that have come out in the past 10 years or like you said, Ted Lasso, like this, watching even just a sitcom, a single camera sitcom. And that's the norm now. It's almost more bizarre to do an action movie where you use no green screen than it would be to use entirely green screen or blue screen.
Right. Well, and I think you can see that in the performances here because we have great actors. Like by and large, there are great actors in this film.
Jackson, McGregor,
right?
Christopher Lee.
Yeah, there's great actors in this, and actors who have gone on to give great performances, before and after this film, for sure. So it's not a question that there's not talent in this film. There's definitely talent in this film. Mm-hmm. So but maybe what we're looking at is, a different style of acting had not yet kind of come to maturity. Mm-hmm. Where actors didn't have great experience acting in a green screen, in a room with nothing, to a tennis ball, like you said. And so it's probably a combination of actors, but also directors and the filmmakers themselves giving better tools to actors to work in those environments where, now we have an evolution of performance where there's still some challenges for sure, but by and large, performances have much improved in these virtual environments. But I think in this film, we see, the performances really take a hit. They're also challenged with delivering just really difficult
wooden dialogue.
The dialogue is just sometimes so challenging, and so it's like I can only imagine. You're staring into nothing. You're looking at nobody, and then you've got Lucas's dialogue to deliver.
Well, and I think that's probably an insight too on the difference again between like something like A New Hope, where Lucas wrote the screenplay for that, and there's a lot of really funny stories about Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford kind of making fun of Lucas to his face about how bad the dialogue was and changing it, because Lucas just didn't have as much power at that point, because he was that wasn't something that he was entirely self-financing then. And now with his kind of totality of power in these movies, perhaps it was his choice to make.
He's become whoa, okay.
He has become
so,
what
Cullen,
he feared.
This is it. Like, this is it. He is like the Palpatine in his own Star Wars world, where that's it.
Yeah.
You've nailed it. I mean, this is like
it.
the meta, like the meta story within. Yeah. I mean, that's definitely possible hypothesis. I mean, when he made Star Wars in '77, he was so much younger, and I think I have no doubts he was a confident filmmaker. But maybe, by the time, we roll around to 2002 and he's making this film, maybe he didn't, he was less likely to change what he had written based on the, critique or criticism or feedback from the actors. I don't know. He probably, my guess is that he felt like he had to be much more specific with it again, because just based on his commentary, it's like he felt like he had to service all these different mechanizations in the plot. And so and you just have exposition upon exposition upon exposition of these characters saying things, and they have to be specific to fit into all, like this jigsaw puzzle of, it's like taking a piece, putting it into a puzzle that's already almost completely solved. It's like the piece has to be, fit in all these weird ways on every side.
You might have to take some scissors and cut it into shape to get in there, right?
So,
'cause it might just not make sense.
Probably,
and so I think it's also really fascinating, because obviously the movie Phantom Menace was shot on film. This was shot on digital. This was one of the first full length feature films to be shot entirely digitally,
right?
Which, as we know, completely changed the film industry as well. It in a lot of ways, democratized it, and so that's probably one of the pros that it really ushered in an era where you and I could go and buy a camera that, I shot my first feature digitally, of course. And
sure, me too. Of course. I've never gotten to shoot on film.
Yeah.
The only thing
I've
ever
shot on like 16 and 8mm, but never a feature.
And never on 35. And you're right. I mean, it really is extraordinary, and is certainly, on the cutting edge of that. I mean, and it's just, and you definitely can see it though. I mean, the film doesn't look great, in my humble opinion. I mean, was shot on the Sony Cinalta HDW F900. Boy, that's a mouthful. Which is like a 2/3 inch sensor. But I think you had talked about that's not even. I mean, it says it's a Cine camera, but
it's a modified broadcast camera.
Right.
Suit cinema, so it can shoot in 24 frames per second as opposed to 30 and things
and
like that.
That was a big deal then, right? I mean, being able to actually match digitally 24 frames per second, which of course is the speed that most films are, like actual film movies are shot in. Of course, you can ramp that up and ramp that down for different special effects, but 24 frames per second would be what you'd need to match a film movie. And you couldn't do that before. I mean, video was always a totally different thing. So that was a big deal. But I mean, gosh, you can really see kind of the infancy of this technology had on the film. Because I personally think it looks much, much, much worse than the first three films.
Even Phantom Menace. Like, I think Phantom Menace, for all of its faults, actually looks decent in a lot of moments, because it's just, you have a nicer medium to work with. And even the practical effects and the digital effects seem to blend better, because you have, film naturally kind of just washes everything into each other almost a little bit more, makes it a little bit more, painterly and things like that. Whereas digital, you find that with really hyper sharp digital and digital effects, you kind of have this like almost, it looks like a cutout that's kind of walking across the screen. So I think that that kind of almost in a way worked against the visual effects. I find that, and it was also something that Lucas really wanted to do, because he could then go into more digital effects. And so it was kind of a double whammy there, where not only were the practical and digital effects in Phantom Menace a little bit better looking, because there were fewer digital effects, more practical, it was a more established style of filmmaking. But here you've got him going, okay, if we're shooting digitally, then I can use way less practical effects. Like, there's only a few notable practical effects in this movie. I know that the big Coliseum at the end is a practical like miniature. I think some of like Camino stuff, the clone planet was some miniatures, and I think some of the like inserts on Coruscant when he goes to the diner, I think that was a enhanced with CGI, but I think that was actually a practical like model. So you've got a few, but again, you're leaning way more into just a full reliance on digital effects here, and not only that, but you also wind up with something like a broadcast camera. Like, you lose so much dynamic range on these early broadcast cameras, so the highlights are all blown out often, and it really does make it look a lot more video. I think subconsciously audiences do notice that stuff and kind of go like, why am I, like, even if you know nothing about the technology,
right,
you might be sitting there kind of going like, well, why does this look kind of weird to me? And so I think that those are all like really, and I think it's also interesting that people often look at Avatar, which came out 2009, as the inception of digital projection. Obviously, digital projection existed before that, but Avatar was really when digital projection became widespread.
Right.
But Lucas was, when this came out in 2002, pushing for theaters to switch, and a few did. Not everyone did, but it actually, if you look at kind of the numbers, it really started here. Avatar was just kind of the straw that broke the camel's back, but it ultimately was Lucas here really pushing for digital projection that started that switch over, much in the same way that it started the switch over to wholly digital projection. The vast majority, if a listener who perhaps doesn't know much about the industry, the vast majority of films and TV shows these days are not shot on film, they're shot digitally. And it's usually reserved for either very special projects or established directors who get to actually shoot on real film. So
it's very interesting. I mean, you really can't overstate in all of the different ways the impact that this film had, and as part of this trilogy, of course, behind ILM and George Lucas, how much it's had on the whole production process of cinema. I mean, from the cameras and the medium that is used to shoot the story with, moving to digital, to CGI versus practical effects, and then to distribution itself, where instead of sending reels of film to a theater, they've just got a file that they play on a projector.
A little DCP.
So and obviously we're still experiencing the transition of a lot of those things and the progression of those technologies. And so it's like, and you can love it, you can hate it, you can but it's just, cinema has always been an art form that's been deeply connected to technology. They go hand in hand. It's not like painting, where canvases and paintbrushes haven't changed, and even paints have hardly changed in 200 years. A painter is going to want to smack me in the face, because I'm sure the technology of paints have definitely changed. But you get my point, I think, that cinema has always been deeply connected to technology, and and technology has pushed cinema, and cinema has been pushed technology, and so it's like you can't fight the evolution of that in a sense. I on a personal note, though, I just do want to say, I mean, I talked about kind of feeling like one of the big reasons that I felt so disconnected to this film was that I didn't feel any stake really in the story, right? I just, the stakes don't feel real. I'm not afraid for my characters. A big part of that for me, and I'm old. I'm 47 years old. I grew up in a world before CGI, so I know. I'm like, people call me boomer, even though I'm not a boomer, guys. I'm Gen X. But I know. It's like, I'm going to here's my boomer moment. Maybe we could have like a section where I have like a boomer moment, right?
We got a little intro.
Yeah,
a bit like
Maybe I'll put an intro on this. We can get a piece of music. We can get some kind of music for it. But and I was in a conversation with somebody online about this, where it was a debate about best chase sequence in a film, and they presented the chase sequence in the Matrix, maybe the second Matrix film.
I think it's Reloaded,
where they're in all the Cadillacs, and
on the highway, right?
On the highway, right? Yeah. And they destroyed like 100 Cadillacs or something. Cadillac sponsored that, is what I remember most about that scene. And they suggested that was maybe one of the best chase sequences that had ever been put on film. And I retorted with, I think that the final 30 minutes-ish of Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, is a by far superior chase sequence. And there are several reasons why I think that, but one of the big ones I argued was that when I watch that Mad Max 2 chase sequence, I see real people on and in real cars, in a real environment, doing real stunts, while I'm not negating the fact that, of course, there is movie magic going on. I know there's movie magic going on, and they're cheating everything they can possibly cheat, because you can't just like throw people under cars. I get
there's
that.
There's a limit to the danger, but yeah.
But there is something that happens where, in my mind, that reinforces the fictional story I'm seeing, where I know these are real people, and that there is a real athleticism, and there's a real risk, and there's actually something real going on in front of the camera, and I'm watching it.
Yeah.
That, to me, it's so much more impactful. Let me try to make another analogy. Okay, if I listen to, let's say I'm listening to a piece of music, I'm listening to like Eddie Van Halen play guitar, and I don't know anything about guitar. I've never seen a guitar, right? I don't even know what the hell a guitar is, but I'm listening to it, and I can appreciate this piece of music. It's like these notes that are flowing forth into my headphones, and it sounds pretty wild. It's like a bunch of really like high-speed notes, and wow, okay, that's cool. But then let's see, I see a video of Eddie Van Halen playing that same piece of music. And now I'm looking at a guitar, and I can see how it's made, and I see his hands move, and I recognize now, because I can see his hands moving on the fretboard, that there is a profound amount of athleticism and dexterity, and that, God, that must take a ton of practice, right? There's a performance going on here, is what I'm trying to get at, from a human, that I can clearly see required a profound amount of talent.
Well, even it would be the sort of
That's
the difference. It would be like the difference between going to see something. Like, I always ask people about this when I have this conversation, which is, would you be more engaged if you were seeing a play, like a in-person theater, and there was a point where somebody got lit on fire, and they actually lit somebody on fire, obviously with like safety stuff and stuff, but you're watching a play, so you don't know any of that.
Right.
Versus if they just took like a projector and projected flames on them, which can look cool, it can look really good, and there's artistry to that too. But what would engage you more? Probably the real fire, right? Probably.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't know. I mean, it's an interesting question. That's an interesting analogy. I think the reality of it is that if that happened, it would probably take people out of the story, because they would actually think the person was really on fire, and I think an audience would freak the F out.
But, I mean, of course, in the context of a play.
But I get your point. But I get your point. I just want to finish that it's. But I do get your point. I agree with you. And again, it's not to say that I understand that the artist, the hundreds, the thousands of artists that it takes, the animators, the programmers, the developers of the software. I mean, there is profound artistry in the CGI that goes into these films. I understand that. I do appreciate that. But for me personally, there is just something about seeing humans perform on camera that raises the stakes for me somehow, right? And it's not. I'm not somebody who's like, well, CGI has no place. I mean, I'm not that. I'm not dogmatic about it. But so I guess it just kind of, when I watch this film and what Star Wars turned into, I just see cartoons. I just see cartoons with like a few humans in there once in a while, and it's just not compelling.
Well, I think it even goes back again to the roots of this podcast too, where I can't remember what Herzog episode it is, but we talk about how Herzog describes like he would never have done Fitzcarraldo if he couldn't pull the boat over for real. Like, he would never have done that as a miniature, because the audience would just know that there was no effort into that, and that the whole point of it is that you're feeling and exuding the effort of the actors who are there in the jungle, literally pulling a boat over a thing. And I'm not anti CGI either. I'm actually in the process of trying to learn how to do like computer effects a lot more effectively, because it's something that I have a very big blind spot with, and they can be super, super useful. But I think that the difference is good CG, as with any visual effect, and this goes back to miniatures, this goes back to stop motion, this is not just an anti-computer or anti-digital stance. It's not really anti-anything, but that good computer effects and good computer graphics, good CGI should be there to accentuate and to enhance a scene, not to build a scene. It shouldn't be there to build a moment. That's one of the, I think that's just the reason I think so many people relate to practical effects, even miniatures, even though that is the same principle as CG. You're not like, it's not like the actors are really walking on a miniature. They're inserted there through optical effects.
Right.
But the difference is that the way that you film the miniatures, the way the light bounces and things like that, there's just a more grounded approach. And I know a lot of visual effects artists. One of my good friends works for not Digital Domain, Double Negative, which is a really big, famous digital visual effects company. And from the people that I've spoken to there is a huge understanding of that. There's a huge understanding that you've got to have a grounded sense of like realism and something grounding these effects in the moment in order for them to work. And that's what is, I think, the tragedy about a lot of the way that films are made today, is that you've got directors and producers and things like that who perhaps don't understand how visual effects are made, and so they are way too overly reliant on them. You hear about all these horror stories about visual effects companies just not getting paid, like on Life of Pi and a lot of the Marvel movies where they're completely underpaid and overworked, and where a director will come with like a week to the deadline and go like, hey, we need to change this element, and it's something that would require the scene to be built up from the ground up, and they just don't understand that. And that's, I think, where the issue is. And I think it's way easier to fall into that with digital effects than it is with practicals, because as a director, even if you know nothing about filming practical effects, you still walk into a studio and say, you can't just say like, hey, can we make this 3 times bigger? And you just naturally would know,
it's
well, wait,
intuitive.
you can't do that. Whereas with something like CGI, it's like, oh, well, actually, I wanted Iron Man's suit to be a little bit darker than that. Yeah, to me, who doesn't know how to do CGI, that's easy. You think
it's like flipping a switch. You're like, well, just turn that dial.
And but what you don't know is that it probably involves the textures. It probably involves the way that the light bounces off of that texture. It probably involves the way the actor's face reflects and things like that. And
profoundly complicated. And I think you bring up a really good point, Cullen. And we've gone a little bit down this path, but I think it's valid though, because I think this. The film that we're talking about, Attack of the Clones, is like we've said, this is like a crossroads in cinema. I mean, this is like the fork in the road. This film is the fork. And so I think it's worthy of spending some time on. But what you just made me think of is like, when I listen to myself, and I'm like always finding my own feelings about something as I speak. So, I might feel something now about something. I might feel one way about something now.
Yeah.
But as I speak through it, I'm like always learning, and my opinions are always changing. So I don't ever want to get dogmatic about it. But as I try to better understand my own, like how cinema impacts me, and I think like, okay, well, why is that? Why am I more impacted by seeing like a real stunt person jump off a car, onto a moving truck, right? And I can see that it's real, and I can see that it's moving. I'm like, well, it's because it amplifies the threat to the character, right? It's like, I know the stunt person is an actor. I think stunt people are actors too. I would call them. They're just a specialized type of actor, right? So I see that, and I know that none of these characters are actually right. I know that Mad Max is Mel Gibson. I know that guy with the mohawk, on the truck who's jumping onto the tractor trailer is not really in this real world,
and he's not really trying to kill Mel Gibson,
right? And I know all that's fake, but there's something about when you see the actor or stunt person do actual feats like in real life, that it actually helps emphasize the impact of the character of the story onto you viscerally, right? Like you relate to it. You're like, oh my God, can you imagine how like scary that must be to like have someone jump onto the side of your, I mean, you're like, it just helps create this visceral response, because you're like, holy crap, like that's a human being doing that. I'm a human being. What if I were doing that? Oh my gosh. I mean, it directly connects you to the story. I feel like computer graphics are are equally amazing, right? They take an equal amount of skill. And even when I use that example of like the athleticism of guitar playing, I get that there is an athleticism to computer programming too. I get that there's an art. I get that it takes a huge amount of time, that it takes a tremendous amount of time to learn how to do that and perfect those tools and develop your own style. And it's this amazingly complex combination of science and technology and artistry. And so it's just as compelling and interesting, but it's also so much more abstracted. Mm-hmm. It's so much more removed, though, from the visceral. And I think that's the challenge. It's like, yes, a stunt person jumping from one car to another at speed it's simple in a sense. It's dangerous. Of course, you can be a good stunt person and you can design that safely. But I mean, it's very simple, but it's very visceral, which works for cinema. I feel like when you have like layer after layer after layer after layer of abstraction, it's harder for me as an audience to relate. And so you were just saying like, well, the director can't even relate to the artistry of like what ILM does, CGI. They don't even often can't relate. It's like, well, can you just make this thing different? Just because they don't. It's so elevated and abstracted and specific.
Yeah.
It's such a specialized area of information and knowledge that it's like it's hard to be impacted viscerally by it. So I can appreciate an extraordinary vista that a CGI world, but it's so abstracted to me that I'm kind of like.
Whereas like the simplicity of a matte painting, I know the effort that it would have taken to do. And it's not. I think that's the big mistake to me, and this would probably be like the kind of my final thought on this is just that I think the biggest mistake in the inception of like CGI as a filmmaking tool, and I think that again most visual effects artists would agree with this, from the ones that I've spoken to and the ones that I've seen talk, is that instead of being used as a new tool, they were used as a replacement. Mm-hmm. And they were used to replace things that had already had established ways of doing things and things that worked. And like you can very happily marry practical effects with computer graphics. And you can do very complicated things with computer graphics that are impossible to do otherwise. And that's fantastic. It really unlocks a whole slew of things. But, when you have a director who's just like, well, we don't need to build any of this stuff because we'll just do it all afterwards, and we don't need to actually film someone jumping from the car because we'll just get a digital fake body in there. That's when it becomes really, really I think a net negative. And I think that it's the shame, because I think a lot of people are there's a misconception about it too. I think visual effects artists get a lot of flack for it that they don't deserve, because it's not their decision to do these things.
Sure.
I think they would much rather be doing the things that looks good and that assists a film, rather than just completely being what's relied upon to even build entire sets these days. So yeah.
It's interesting. And I guess I'll just wrap up the conversation by saying, I mean, and CGI has certainly come a long way. Digital filmmaking has certainly come a long way. I mean, this was a film that was made in the pioneering days of that. And so the fact that he was even able to pull it off, period, that ILM were able to pull it off, period, is impressive, regardless of what.
Absolutely.
And obviously you look at where films are now, and there is some extraordinary CGI work, and I think it'll continue to be better integrated into filmmaking. Certainly, digital cameras have gotten orders of magnitude better, right?
Yeah.
Since the filming of this movie, so it'll be. I'm just always excited to see where technology goes, and I think these tools will be better integrated. But yeah, what a talk about cutting edge. Episode 2, and I hadn't thought about this in a long time since this podcast was really a sign of things to come. Wow.
Yeah.
Well, here we are, I guess, at the end of the episode. Cullen, I appreciate your risque, controversial choice. Yeah. Now that I feel like it's on me to like think of something equally. I'm like, what can I think of myself to try to top this? I don't know what that'll be, so I'll have to put some thought into that. But I really enjoyed our conversation as always, and everyone out there listening, I hope you did as well. And until next time, everybody, we'll see you on the flip side.
Bye-bye.